In that case, I will welcome the Prime Minister to open the case for the government bench.
Hey, just making sure I'm audible.
You are, yeah.
Sweet. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there are grandparents across Europe that are going to die of freezing to death in their homes because they will not be able to afford with their pensions access to heating. Absent literally any other consideration in this debate panel, if we can prove to you that we deliver energy at a cost that is affordable to those that desperately need it across this winter, we win today's debate. Nothing else really matters in comparison to that. Just to set up a couple things before we begin, just at what point do we think they're going to be so we be stabilizing these prices at around pre-2020 levels, and we think we've removed them once either prices had stabilized back down to that at that level, accounting for inflation, or at the point that it was just literally untenable anymore. We're going to prove to you why we'll be able to afford this, why it's going to be an incredibly short-term thing while prices will naturally stabilize anyway. And just to preempt, why are some of the options that we think that they're going to bring up for counterfactual just straight up aren't going to work? First of all, flat handouts have been proposed in the UK aren't going to work because families have incredibly diverse energy needs. That is that the government is going to be overspending on some families in terms of just a flat subsidy and underspending on other ones. We'd rather be calibrate it to the point where you need energy. We think families are generally pretty good at recognizing what they need and sort of not overspending. We think people are rational calculus about not wanting to naturally overspend regardless. We don't think people overuse energy. But second of all, we're not going to be means testing this because we naturally think that systems of bureaucracy are incredibly inefficient at allowing people to access things that are means tested. We tell you that you naturally create steps that make it really difficult for people that are the poorest to have access to these programs. We tell you these people often have lack access to electricity, who aren't are too frail to go down to the benefits shop and ask and to qualify this for this kind of thing. Even if you sort of naturally qualified as an we tell you too much bureaucracy. There are people who are left out. Those people will still die. That's a harm under our side of the house. Okay, so based on this, why do we tell you that energy prices are going to go down? This is relatively intuitive, right? At the point that you cap prices, we tell you that just you go back to those price levels that they were originally. That these are things that people could afford in the first instance, will continue to be able to afford. What does that what does that really mean under the side of the house? We tell you the mechanism by which it goes down is relatively fair. Okay, couple of things here. First of all, you just stop that freezing to death, right? Because at the point that people can afford energy, they're able to do the things that they do naturally. Notably, we tell you that across Europe, winter is particularly cold, and also that you have a lot of people who live in particularly old housing that doesn't have things significant insulation, that wasn't built in the same way that houses in places like Australia and America were built, where significantly more modernly. We tell you that necessarily you need things to have access to things like refrigeration so that you can eat through the winter. As you have access to really basic things like being able to power up your car if you have an electric car, to be able to get to work, very, very basic functions to be able to do things like work at home. We tell you that at the point you can't afford electricity, which we tell you across parts of Europe right now, people quite literally can't. Some people, as power bills are predicted to increase by literally 5 times, you necessarily allow them to basically survive. That is a huge benefit under our side of the house. But secondarily, we tell you allow things to do people to do things very broadly economically. So you tell you there's a problem right now where energy prices, because they're so based in the in the conflict that is in Russia, are incredibly in flux, and people can't really make predictions based on what energy prices are going to be in literally 2 weeks, let alone 6 months, a year. This means it's really hard to do things like basic planning. That is, people are sort of naturally going to save a lot more money, to hoard a lot more money, to not spend, because they don't understand how much their very basic and now quite significant cost of living is going to be at the point they're prioritizing that cost. That means you have just significantly less economic activity, right? Because you're not going to be spending money, you're not going to be investing your money. Particularly, this is true of people that are middle class-ish, who generally are pretty active consumers across the continent. We tell you that those people, for the country to survive, for countries to survive, need to continue to spend. What we tell you is at the point that people can't plan, you have basically economic collapse, because no one's going to be spending anything, because people are going to be terrified of this. Even at the point that prices do stabilize in say 6 months, if there is still fear that prolongs after this, because they don't know that this policy could be implemented after the fact, there's still going to be these increases in problems. We tell you that at that point the energy costs go down, the economy works, that you have people being able to exist. That is literally the most important thing in today's debate. Very briefly, to preempt something that they might say here, why is it not true that we're going to have a problem with energy access? And that is that the problem that is causing this increase in prices is incredibly localized to the pipelines that exist with Russia. Couple of things here. First of all, we think this is going to be a pretty short-term problem. We tell you at the point that Europe and America continue to support Ukraine, it is probably true that they'll be kicked out of the region relatively quickly. Second of all, in the short term, we tell you have like pretty easy access to things like being able to buy up barrels of oil from the Middle East, or from pipelines from North America. We tell you that there is a massive increase of costs here, right? Because you're transporting from significantly larger distances. It's less efficient infrastructure, but it means that there will not be a crisis in terms of like having to have blackouts across the continent. It's necessarily true that you'll be able to deliver energy. Additionally, we tell you there's like massive increases in infrastructure investment right now, which means in the sort of long term you have things. So like Germany can turn back on their like nuclear power generation. We tell you there's an increase in investment into things like the solar grid in regions that are sort of adjacent but not necessarily in like the middle of Europe. We tell you that those things you have like significantly more long-term stability, which can be tided over for right now. And we tell you have options, but they're just a bit more expensive. Necessarily, therefore, at the point that you implement this price cap, you can get that energy at a price that's affordable without blackouts. I'll take closing.
You've conceded the unpredictability of energy prices, at least for the next foreseeable, let's say 6 months or so. How do you think governments deal with this unpredictability in price?
Like, we think we just continue to subsidize these things, right? Like, we think like across Europe, countries tend to have like pretty decent rates at which they can borrow money. We tell you that like if we're only saying it's gonna be like 6 months to a year until you like be able to stabilize things at least by like turning back on nuclear generation in Germany, something which like would like literally alleviate this crisis, right? You're able to borrow for now. Like that's probably fine. They'll take out debt. They'll pay it all back. It's gonna be totally sick. But then what we tell you is like in sort of the interim term, like what happens this winter in terms of political capital? Because we tell you that at the point that you either have blackouts or at the point where you have really high prices, like European governments are going to want to change. There's going to be a lot of pressure to change things in two ways. First of all, there's going to be massive pressure to withdraw support from Ukraine. This is really, really, really bad. A couple of things why. First of all, it's really bad to prove to show Russia that Europe is willing to step away from this conflict, because it necessarily proves that they are able to be more like aggressive in their posturing towards these things. It could mean that you increase their incentive to do things like go into Finland because they're likely to withdraw at the point that you hurt their oil supply. It's also going to mean that Russia is going to be way more aggressive with how they treat their oil supply going forward in terms of their geopolitical strategy. That is, they will continue to threaten to cut off oil anytime they do these things because it will create the concessions that they necessarily want. Second of all, we tell you that you're going to increase in support for sort of right-wing populist parties that support these changes in Russia. So even if you don't get that change in Russia, that change in policy, you necessarily have more people listening to voices that want this. These are voices that are oftentimes incredibly like supported by Putin, that promote mass disinformation, that oftentimes connect to things like Nazi and fascist movements within certain countries. That's a really, really bad thing. And then finally, we briefly tell you that there's a demonization of things like green energy, which are necessarily very important. Terry's going to talk way more about this. Side for like no grandma's death, side with OG. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for her speech. And now to open the case for the opposition bench, I'll call on the leader of that side.
Right, am I audible?
You are, yeah.
Sure, give me a second. Okay. I'll take POIs in the chat. I'm paying attention to the chat. So I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. There's a specific reason why OG themselves says that energy prices are unpredictable. And this is strategically important, which means in the next 2 months, certain things may turn around, prices may go low. In the next 3 months, it may go low. And I'll probably list a couple of reasons why this could be so. But first of all, let me deal with the way in which pricing is currently done. Given that there are no caps and governments don't absorb any form of cost, and also given that suppliers know that there is a reasonable spending limit that people can purchase at, they are able to sort of have much more intense negotiations with generators to say, even though we understand the conditions, you would need to be fair in some instances, because if not, we may put the prices out there and nobody can purchase. And that's why we've seen that even though since the war in Ukraine started, prices skyrocketed, like boom, boom, boom. We've seen that in recent times, it's really been relatively stable, where the marginal increases and decreases exist within a fairly stable spectrum, which means that this increase is really not getting out of hand to the point where you need to employ this policy. Specifically, given that I'm going to be analyzing why this kind of spending that's going to go on their side would massively worsen inflation in a way that undercuts all of the benefits that they are going to talk about. Secondly, I think that there are certain mechanisms that European governments are already taking into place, putting in place to be able to mitigate these things. For instance, buying Russian oil from African countries whom Russia is selling to for very cheaper prices, so that instead of buying directly from Russia, they're able to use them as fronting faces to be able to buy this particular oil from Russia. Those are means by which they're employing to pack up oil for the winter that OG so much cares about, without necessarily having to spend that huge amounts of money, which means that also, some of the reasons why you'd probably see the European government not hugely subsidizing caps in the now is because rationally, they're probably spending that money on stocking up oil for the winter and all the things that they talk about, which means that they are spending priorities that ought to be made here, especially given that Europe is also facing an inflation crisis, which we're going to analyze in a bit. Now, let's talk about why this massively increases inflation in European countries. One, because notice that these government subsidies are going to be subsidizing prices in a way that reduces the cost for consumers. 3 structural reasons why this would increase inflation. One, because like we've seen, Russia is already reducing the flow from Nord Stream 1 to Europe, which even though, like we've seen, is ideally supposed to skyrocket prices, it is not, because of the mutual agreement that I talked about earlier between suppliers and generators, who are able to rationalize that they still need to moderate pricing in a way that consumers can purchase. Secondly, OPEC deciding to cut down oil generation across board just last week, etc. What this means is that even though we've seen indicators in very recent time that should have skyrocketed prices beyond where they are now, there is a natural mechanism of understanding between generators and suppliers that is able to fairly stabilize pricing to the point where consumers can purchase. Why is this crucial? Because they know that only consumers are purchasing, they have to be reasonable. In a world where states step in to cap these prices, generators, who are obviously also seeking to maximize enough profit, are then now free to skyrocket the pricing, given the recent indicators that happen with supply shortages and supply machinations. Why? Because they now say that the direct impact is not really on the consumer, because states are going to absorb the cost either way. What it means is that they are going to substantially increase the prices from generators to suppliers, given that they know that these prices are going to be subsidized. What this means is that you are going to have the government spending huge sums of money to be able to absorb these particular subsidies that happen. Specifically, why is this bad? In 2 ways. One, because this kind of spending, given that Europe has already drawn its budget, they've already decided which inflationary calculations they've done to be able to allocate budgetary, is one, unpredictable in the way in which it would affect inflation, because it's likely going to require more printing of money and various things that are active indicators of inflationary boom. What this means is that we are going to print billions of dollars to be able to supplement this new budgetary allocation. We are going to alter the way in which economists have sat for decades to be able to plan these particular, and for the entire year to be able to plan in a way that doesn't increase inflation. Before I move on, Rumen.
But we have other ways to deal with inflation that we're already symmetrically doing, like, for example, raising of interest rates that lower the money supply, which leads to a lowering of it, that happens symmetrically.
Exactly my point. Because if you are raising interest rates to lower inflation and you are going counter to it to go and print more money into the system, then you are eventually canceling your mechanism of like dealing with inflation, which means that you don't get to deal with inflation in the end. Secondly, even if you are to lower cheaper fuel, you are to get cheaper fuel prices in the now, I am not sure why that is good for inflation. Because, for instance, what you do is to free up more cash and disposable income for people to spend. What that does is that people with an incentive to spend then decide to start spending. You spike up demand because people have more money to spend. That means that supply shortages start to exist within the supply chain systems, and then prices rise again. So in the long term, prices are still going to rise. Inflation is just going to keep increasing. I am not sure why reducing fuel prices right now is the most strategic decision for most European economies to do. And the reason why this way is crucial is the long-term impact of inflation, because note, inflation means that prices rise, but generally, even most economists tell you, and we've all known this through our experiences, prices barely come down, right? Even after inflationary percentages have gone down in the future, prices went up with inflation barely come down, which means that the impacts of inflation are usually long-term on cost of living in a way that cannot be tracked back. What it means is that you engage in this spending, even if it reduces fuel pricing in the now, which I tell you will still in the short term, about 2 weeks later, still skyrocket goods prices, which means you undermine that cushioning because probably people don't spend more on food, but they have to spend more on all other things like groceries, like food supply, etc. And that sustains itself for the long term because the prices would never come down even after inflationary percentages increase. You do a solution for a short-term problem that creates a long-term problem, and with a solution that creates a much more long-term economic inconvenience for citizens and for the state in a way that is far more terrible, right? The reason why the weighing here is important is because currently, note, people within Europe are most likely not blaming European governments for energy crisis. But what they are doing is blaming them for inflationary crisis because they think they have the ability to regulate inflation. And that's why Rumen says they are now increasing interest rates and they're expecting them to do so, which means it's politically important for them. When you engage in solving a problem that is not politically suicidal to worsen one that is politically suicidal, I am not exactly sure why this is better for Europe or better for European countries and their governments within general, given that this is specifically about the government making decisions and whether those decisions would be in the best interest of both the states and in themselves as governments. This is much more terrible for Gov. We've never been this proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the government bench, I'll call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
You are, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, in my speech, I'm going to try to mainly refute and respond to what the previous speaker from opening opposition has brought up in this debate. First of all, the opening opposition demonstrates a very powerful concern about how prices will generally spike after this policy is implemented, right? But we think that actually in the status quo, these electricity generators and suppliers are creating agreements right now at the best place possible. And like, we think that generally, this kind of agreements and price mediations between generating suppliers will end up stabilizing costs at the end of the day, instead of just, I would say, infinitely spiking the prices up. And also, we think that in terms of inflation, we think that this effect is not really as damaging as what the opening opposition speaker talks about, because these governments are going to continuously start to borrowing money anyway. So we don't think that really this brings so detrimental harm at the end. But furthermore, I would like to put some emphasis in terms of why it is so necessary at this point to all houses to why we should implement this price capping policy across all families, and also right now at this point. Number one, I think that our Prime Minister has significantly emphasized about how this problem that puts people's life at stake is really imminent, and how it's really desperate at this moment when a deadly winter's coming up, right? So we think that instead of bringing in a fancy calculus about what will happen in the long term, I think what matters primarily for the government in our world is that we need to save these people who are basically suffering due to superly high energy costs, right? So we think that because that's the government's priority, that is why now is necessary. But also, we think we have to note about the politically unstable context that is happening since the pandemic, right? We think that the problem of pandemic has not only been affecting a certain sect of families, certain set of populations, but it has been generally deadly across the country, right? Thus, we think that there's a consensus among people that really, regardless of the socioeconomic costs, or really regardless of like whether you are actually able to afford energy in this deadly winter, like you are all victims of this you're all victims of this economic crisis happening by the pandemic, because rich people, they actually have problems in operating their businesses, and low-cost workers, they basically can't get a job. Thus, we think that when distrust or maybe instability in terms of politics is highly rising, it's really important to provide a tangible short-term compensation for these people to make sure that domestic politics is also stabilized at the end of the day. But also, we think that the long-term circumstances that's about to come up in terms of oil is actually much better than what the opposition predicts it to be, right? Our prime minister talks about how basically as the political situation surrounding Ukraine and Russia is getting much better for Ukraine, we think Russia will basically lose more bargain power in terms of energy costs, energy pricing. Thus, we argue that in the long term, actually energy supplies will be pretty much normalized, and that inflation is actually not only a problem that will happen or spike up due to this issue of energy price capping. Before I move on, I'll take POIs if there are any, closing government or opening opposition.
Yes,
or closing
yeah.
opposition.
Okay, to be clear, the context that the government side is forwarding in this debate is that there are currently numerous reasons and indicators as to why prices will rise during the winter. This will make Europeans less able to afford gas and colder, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so that's obviously what we're talking about. So just have to clarify, what we're saying is that energy prices are currently extremely high, and that price capping is the measure to, at least in the short term, bring down the prices. And actually, we think although there has been concerns coming from opposition regarding like how unpredictable these prices might also be, we think that prices are predictable because under our world, we hold simply much more control of the variable, right? Because even if we implement a price cap, like price might fluctuate or maybe oscillate around that cap, but still we think when the government can set a limit price, there's much more higher predictability about the economic prospects or the prospect of economic costs. So we think in terms of that, there's no much big concern. So yeah, and that would be the end of my speech.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his speech. And now to close out the top half of the debate, I'll call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Cool, can I be heard?
You can, yeah.
Cool. In a defiant act against the motion, I'm going to take off my sweater before I speak. Cool. Right. So the structure of this speech is going to be very simple. I'm going to deal with the political stuff that we heard out of opening government, explain why it's probably not that significant, doesn't change that much, and then deal heavily with the economic argument we brought to you in opening opposition. Starting off with the political argument, their idea here being that it sends a signal towards Russia and that kind of thing, and a domestic signal as well. Firstly, they themselves say that the war in Russia is likely to end soon either way, so it's unclear what the effect of this signal is. Secondly, we would say that economic signals are less important than political signals, i.e. what the politicians say about the war in Ukraine, as they've been called upon to speak about consistently. It's probably a much more important signal to Russia than what the economy is doing. And it's also largely contingent on how the justification of the economic decision is made. So for example, on our side, if we say we're not going to implement these things because it will lead to massive inflation, on their side, they say, oh, we are going to implement these things to help people out on the ground, those don't form political signals. Thirdly, with regards to the idea of domestic populism, I would also propose that economic crises lead to populism as well, which can also antagonize Russia in the future as well, insofar as these groups tend to be quite nativist and that kind of thing. And insofar as our effects are more long-lasting, as I'll explain later, this effect is more acute on their side of the house. So, inflation. Cost of energy is massively high. This is because of COVID. Manufacturing in tight-knit areas, as you have in energy markets and that kind of thing, hasn't been able to be, continued in a lot of instances. It's been supply chain shortages for similar reasons. Secondly, because of the war in Ukraine, not just because of the danger of the actual individual lines, but because of retaliatory sanctioning between the two sides. The demand for energy is high. Globally, it's quite high, especially as we enter into the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, where all the economic capital is. Therefore, the cost of this is going to be extremely high, especially in the context that we told you, where the generators who sell it to the suppliers now know that they have a definite purchase from the suppliers, because the difference in what the suppliers can pay will be made up by the government, so they can afford to increase prices significantly. Even in instances where price gouging is outlawed, which it isn't in a lot of instances, they have easy justifications for this, because they can say that the pricing in the insecurity in the market that opening government is talking about to maintain their long-term stability, but also the lobbying group of energy corporations is quite high, because there's a lot of amount of money in it, so it's not likely to be significant. And even if they were taken to court around these kinds of things, the effect of that would be like very far in the future. These are long drawn out court battles, so they won't lead to increases in the meantime. So the governments have to do things, have to print money, because they don't have their internal resources of capital, of their monetary capital is to an extent limited because of COVID and the war in Ukraine, because they've had to spend a lot of money. But secondly, their domestic expenditure, they can't reallocate funding Firstly, because it's domestic lobbying groups who don't want to lobby, take away that funding. That's why the money's there in the first place. But secondly, because states are already heavily leveraged and have already cut down a lot of things to interact with the fact that they've had to take out a lot of money during COVID stimulus packages. So it's unlikely that they'll be able to engage in that kind of thing. So they will have to necessarily print money, or small states who can't print money will have to leverage themselves even more and more, decrease their credit rating and increase their the turmoil of their economy going forward into the future. So there's a massive increase in the monetary supply. It makes money less valuable. It also makes wages and savings less valuable, and it gives more money to people because those individuals no longer have to spend that money on oil. So the monetary supply is increased. The value of each individual's euro is decreased, or whatever it is, the krona as well in different countries. And so that necessarily means that because the market will respond to that, prices will increase in the market as well. Notably, inflation has already been a trend, stopping it for this one before, but because of COVID-19 stimulus programs and the war in Ukraine. So massive, massive increase in inflation. So under inflation, prices rise, but then wages have to rise to meet those prices, particularly in a moment like right now, where labor is actually really valuable in its negotiating power because of the labor shortage across Europe that's been in the headlines all around the world. This necessarily, therefore, means that this can become its own self-fulfilling spiral, because when prices increase, wages increase, prices increase, wages increase, as more people have more money. So it becomes a self-fulfilling autonomous function of inflation. It's like this hyperinflation, or as it tends to be generally known as. Savings become less valuable and the prices in the economy continue to rise. Notably, these are the savings that people would have spent on energy things because they know that the market is uncertain and they knew that they would have to save up going into the winter for those kinds of things. Notably here then, because energy problems are limited, which is to say the war is coming to an end, as OG say, and indeed all of OG's mechanisms here, COVID is coming to a close, domestic industry is going to be rebuilt, and notably increasing domestic industry doesn't cause inflation because you get more jobs, which means you have less unemployment. So the government is spending less on unemployment, so the monetary supply doesn't meaningfully increase. This necessarily means that you're going to have massive degrees of inflation. CG said you can increase interest rates, but the problem is that that decreases growth because businesses can't grow and develop by leveraging themselves by taking out more loans. That's fine in small doses because if you're able to fix inflation, but the higher inflation is, the more significant that is a harm to the economy because it means that these businesses can't grow. You don't get growth in the economy, but whilst inflation still continues. And if that increases unemployment, because businesses can't employ the increasing populations of the country, that actually can have the perverse effect of increasing inflation as governments need to spend more on unemployment benefits, i.e. increasing the monetary supply in the country. What are the implications of this? Before we go on to the implications, actually, Ruben.
I think you have a wrong understanding as to how inflation works. Inflation happens when you have more money circulating in the economy. If the government gives money to these companies and they presumably just hold it within themselves and don't spend it on shit, then there is no inflation happening.
No, but necessarily these companies will invest it in stuff because inflation is a current trend. So the savings are worth less than they are worth less now than they will be in the, are worth more now than they will be in the future. But also insofar as you give money to people's pockets, that means that the market interacts with it because they're spending less on oil and gas, right? So that necessarily you have two axes along which you increase inflation. Three implications of this. Firstly, it means that people will not be increased in their ability to pay their energy bills because the cost of living in all other areas will increase as well, which means you get no meaningful solvency of the problem that opening government are trying to solve. Secondly, the trajectory is worse because, as we explained to you, inflation has a degree of autonomy in the way it can self-spiral, whereas energy prices will resolve back down to the median. So to the extent that this problem exists, it's going to be a more significant problem longer into the future on their side of the house. Thirdly, we would say that there is some limits on energy cost because at a certain point, individuals cannot pay more than they currently have. And so energy companies have a necessary limit to the prices they can implement. But also some of them are going to be willing to take on losses because they want to maintain long-term customers. So these quite profitable companies oftentimes will compete against each other to keep the prices relatively low in instances, eat their losses to maintain long-term consumer bases. So there's a necessary limit there. There's no limit to inflation, however, because the response process of inflation is the increasing of wages, which contributes to that inflation itself. So that's how the market interacts with that writ large. The meaning for that the meaning of this for the debate is that the political implications of this are likely to not be that significant because of the reasons we've outlined, and to the extent that they are significant, they lean towards us. However, the massive increase of inflation, and is indeed a massive increase in inflation alongside the inflation that currently exists in European economies, is likely to be so deleterious and long-term that it would massively outweigh the harms that would happen on government bench, which indeed we dispute will ever happen because they can be causative of inflation as well. Therefore, you should oppose this motion.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. And now to open the back half of the debate, I'll call on the member of government.
Hi, am I audible?
You are.
I'll take a POI from opening opposition around 5:30. Please, POIs in the chat. Don't unmute yourself. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Very simple structure of the speech. I'll rebut inflation. I'll explain to you why, if we don't do this, this will create economic recession, which will lead to people losing their jobs. And finally, I will, even if you buy, inflation will happen, which maybe to a certain extent will. I will weigh why recession and people losing jobs is more important than inflation. First, let's respond to inflation. Two things here. Firstly, we are not increasing the money supply. We are keeping the money supply as it is. This is the extremely important difference in this sort of case, because we're just allowing people to not have an additional cost that comes to them and to keep the level of money that they're giving. That they give to this in OO is to say, oh, but how people have accounted to the rise in the energy prices and they have budgeted the wrong way. This is, firstly, there is no characterization as to why this is true. Here's counter characterization. Number one, people do not think about this sort of stuff. In many cases, they're busy with their job. They have different priorities. They do not sit down to adequately financial time. Like, ask yourself, how many people do you actually know who sit down and do this sort of thing? But secondly, people want stuff, right? Like in many of these cases, people want to buy out things and they do this sort of thing. You know when they stop spending? They stop spending when they literally do not have the money, right? After the fact, when they see their bank account is low in many of these cases. So there is not going to be any decrease, there is not going to be any increase of spending. We're keeping the spending as it is. If this is the case, then inflation does not happen. The second mechanism which they give is this company will presume, because the government is giving money to the company, then the company will put money in the economy and it will, create inflation. But this is not what this company will do, right? Like, very simple reason. This company is specifically for one specific niche that exists. They do not operate in different types of niches, like, for example, transportation, groceries, these type of things. Why is this important? Because if they're not pumping in money into these sectors, which is what people are buying, they'll most likely pump this money into other things. In many of these cases, most likely it will be a low-risk ETF fund, because this is the sensible thing to do in many of these cases, because it will keep the money secure. Not these companies do not know if the European Union countries are able to do this forever, and because they anticipate these crises, they're likely to do this in a smart and selective way. So you don't have the money pumping this sort of thing. The third and final thing which they say is, well, these companies will presumably, want more money from the governments, but they're in the weak bargaining position in these type of things, because the government is saving them in this sort of case, right? Because otherwise what will happen on the comparative is European people will see the higher energy prices and they will stop consuming energy, right? They'll wear coats in their home, they'll heat their water and do this sort of thing, like they'll not do this sort of thing. So naturally their money will go down. So they're actually welcoming in this money and they do not bargain more in this sort of thing. These are all of their mechanisms. I dealt with them. Let's get into our case. Now, I know OG have words on this argument. They say economic collapse because people don't spend. This is the full extent of their mechanism. There are other logical parts that need to be explained in order for this mechanism to be bought. Let's start with the first one. Why is currently recession or economic collapse, as they said, likely to happen? There are three reasons. Firstly, you have rise in interest rates all across the world. Why is this important? Because when you rise the interest rates, this means that when the central bank basically rises the interest rates, every loan that exists also gets reciprocally, risen, because loans are connected from the loans given from the central bank. That's how the funding works. This means that people have less capacity to spend in many of these cases. This means that businesses do not have revenue and they have, less profitability in these sort of things. Secondly, due to supply chain shocks, in many of these cases, people have stopped, companies have stopped, basically like laid off places, stopped working. Their profitability has been harmed in many of these cases. Thirdly, simply risky decision making. I'm not sure if you've been following the news, but Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank are currently right in front of collapse because they have had risky short-termistic decision making due to them wanting to make money because they weigh risk and words to scandalous way. Investment bankers that have other assets tied up to them that if they default on will create more collapse in these sorts of cases. Why is this important? Because this proves to you that there are necessary preconditions for if you lower the spending more, that many companies will face collapse. Many companies will face negative outcomes if you add this additional huge factor to the equation in these sorts of cases. So opening government's analysis basically goes lines of people will stop spending, thus businesses will, people will stop spending, thus economic collapse will happen. This is where we agree. Here's where we add to this. What happens when people stop spending, right? They have a huge energy bill that's 400 euros and they spend 400 euros less on, for example, clothes, for example, services, for example, sporting gifts, all of the different things that people spend upon. This is when companies have lower revenue streams that are directly reflected in their financial assets. Companies see this sort of thing. This means that this hurts their bottom line. This hurts their profitability. They're making less money in these sorts of cases. What do companies do then? They have to lower costs. companies will not lower costs by not issuing dividends because they have given responsibility to their shareholders, and the people who are on top have a bias towards this sort of thing. They will lay off people. Why? Because this is the simple structural reason. When you have less demand for the stuff that you're producing less of these sorts of stuff. This is the moment when you no longer need to pay for workers because people are buying less of these sorts of things. This is when, in a factory, if you have currently 100% workers, you lower it to 60, 50% workers in this sort of case. Or second possibility, this is not in all cases, but some companies will simply go bankrupt, right? Because they have taken up other additional costs, like for example, loans, like for example, the taxes, like for example, other risky investments that they have had. In this sort of case, the company goes bankrupt in total in this sort of case. So all people lose their job in many of these cases. This is extremely problematic because people will be left unemployed. Before I get into the harms and weighing of this sort of thing, opening opposition, your POI.
I think the POI is that companies will reinvest in their domestic production because if they don't, they'll be outcompeted by those who do, and because they have to have a diversified investment portfolio, even if they're only one industry to maximize returns.
This is true, a competing incentive, I understand, but not when you lose massive amounts of your profitability, right? Not when you use huge amounts of your revenue. And secondly, this happens to all companies. This is the important thing here. It happens to both Puma, both Adidas, both different marks of companies that you have in many of these cases. So it happens to everyone because everyone suddenly doesn't have the money to do this sort of thing, then all people are downgrading. So your competition mechanism doesn't work when it applies to everyone. What are the harms? If people get two sets of harms here. Firstly, these harms apply to people that are not in Europe. This is not an actor motion. This also applies to other populations that exist in the developing world. Number one, these people do not have wonderful socialist republic like Germany in many of these cases to give them welfare and to give them all these sorts of things. So if they go unemployed, they don't have a safety net. But secondly, unemployment skyrockets in the developing world in many of these cases. If Puma stops a factory that exists in Bangladesh, people do not have alternative to go to. Their alternative is crime. But secondly, also it is possible for poor people in Europe, right? This is the other stakeholder for which they do not have a job. And why is this important? Basically, if you do not have a job, it doesn't matter if the price of the bread is €1 or €1.50 or €5. You cannot buy it in any of these cases. You will turn to crime symmetrically in this debate. If you have a job, even if there is a marginal increase in inflation, you can still offset it like this sort of. You can take a loan, you have some savings to do this sort of thing. This is the comparative in this debate. Even if we have to buy inflation to a certain extent, it's better for people to have revenue, to have, their jobs in many of these cases, and in order for them to exist. This is basically how CG, I'm going to say it, breaks the deadlock and wins top half.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And now to continue the case of the opposition bench, I'll call on the member of that side.
Am I audible?
You are, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Our case will take proposition at their best. We will assume that the prices are rising out of hand. We will assume that there are factors that are constantly driving up the prices, and it will become worse over time, as opening government directly concedes to me when I ask them a POI. This has implications that will help us win. All of my case note will be independent of whether you buy closing government's rebuttal to opening opposition as to whether there is inflation or not. So we break that deadlock, which is also inconvenient for us, but also both rebuttal will be integrated to both governments during my speech. If the government is correct, then there are certain factors that they imply drive up prices. These factors tend to have an inconvenient tendency to also be long-term factors that drive up prices in the long term. First of all, not that inflation is symmetric on both sides of the house, because inflation happened pre-war. Years of quantitative easing, but also the pandemic, which note is still uncertain, especially at the moment when we relaxed all measures and therefore allowed the virus to circulate within the population and creating new strands, have created inflation, which is likely to last for years if the government is correct, beyond whether the war ends in a couple of months or not. But secondly, the unpredictability of actors in the war. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline being sabotaged, and we don't know if Russia themselves did it. Putin threatening to turn off the pipe, and we know he did it in 2000 now with Belarus. There's a possibility he might do it again. This unpredictability drives up energy prices. The animosity is going to outlive the war. So this continues to be a possibility if opening government is correct as to what the reasons are as to why the prices are growing. But thirdly, you're likely to get a frozen conflict and not Ukraine winning the war. First of all, because Zelensky has very openly stated he will not stop until he gets back Crimea. Putin will want to maintain the areas he's annexed annexed because that's important for his own political victory. But not also winter is coming, and mud plus ice tends to freeze tanks, which means that you're likely to get a frozen conflict on the Dnieper River as opposed to Ukraine conclusively winning. So the condition that government says is driving up prices is likely to be a condition that lasts over time. The consequence of this is that the prices, and therefore the price differences by the government's own metric, rise over time. And the difference is already huge because opening government, and CG has to follow that, wants to stabilize prices to pre-2020 levels, and inflation and a pandemic happened apart from the war in the meantime, which is to say this is unsustainable for governments in the long term. The consequence of this is that governments who are already strapped for cash insofar as they had a complete halt of economic activity in multiple lockdowns during the pandemic, but are also suffering because of sanctions onto Russia, are now strapped for cash to do a couple of things which are completely independent of whether you buy the inflation clash or not. All of these things are related to directly resolving the energy crisis, both now and in the long term, delivering the very impacts of lower prices that the government wants to stand for. Firstly, stocking up on alternative sources of energy. Know that your potential partners like Iran are likely to hike up prices because they know you have no other alternative. It's incredibly expensive and you have to do it quickly if you want your people not to freeze, as opening government says. Secondly, a quicker green transition, investing huge amounts of money into different sources of green energy and renewable energy. But thirdly, independent sources of gas and electricity within the European Union, building pipelines like the Baltic pipeline and the Greece-Bulgaria pipeline, different infrastructural and transportation networks which need to be built incredibly quickly with a large amount of investment. These are all things that to lower the price of electricity and gas for individuals that the government bench wants to lower them for. But these are also long-term measures which make the European Union independent over the long time, which means we have a bigger time horizon than opening opposition does, but we also don't hedge our bets on prices being unpredictable so they might fall. We rather create a more sustainable solution over time. What opening government says to this is, aha, but people will be cold. Not that the reason why people are cold is very often not direct that they cannot afford the gas. Most middle-class people would at least take credit to pay for their gas. It's that the government is shutting down their heating, is that they're limiting it to a certain temperature in residential buildings, is that they're saying you can only heat from the 1st of December to the 1st of January because the government cannot pay those prices. Therefore, the government is directly outsourcing the cost to the consumers, which is a consequence of the rise in price differences that we are talking about, which means we're able to flip the government benefits on both governments insofar as CG runs a vertical extension. But the money we're talking about and the rise in differences impacts a bunch of other policies, subsidizing businesses affected by the crisis and by COVID, which prevents the layoffs closing government talks about, granting people helicopter money, unemployment subsidies, and various public spending schemes, which give people money if they end up being laid off, which they do on both sides of the house because the inflation that caused the crisis predated the war, which is to say that we get the mechanisms to resolve the things closing government says will happen, and they likely happen on both sides of the house. The second thing, and this is reinforcing opening opposition. Opening opposition says there will be a price hike within the market chain because there is now an incentive to do that because maybe they can outsource the cost to governments. But there's an equally plausible claim on the side of the government, because government can say, but why will they hike up the prices to governments? Isn't it rational to say maybe the governments can't pay it back, so they will also gauge the prices to governments as they would towards citizens? Opening opposition does not explain why one outcome happens instead of the other. Basic debating logic. I'll do that for you. The reason why there's going to be a price hike towards governments is because governments are seen, or at least expected, to be liquid in terms of paying these costs. First of all, because they have access to debt on the international financial market, which is to say that they can borrow money if they need that money. Secondly, because they have various financial instruments they can sell, for example, bonds. But thirdly, because the EU in particular has cohesion fund schemes. The EU is economically interconnected and has quite a lot of trauma of this interconnection causing potential downfall of the euro as a currency and the entire eurozone, note Greece, which is to say they know Germany will subsidize Greece or Slovakia failing to pay this kind of money because it hurts the stability of the entire EU. But fourthly, yes, they can fund it through printing money, if nothing else. But also they're politically expected to be liquid because of path dependency. Before I explain that path dependency mechanism, I'm willing to take opening government.
Do you not still concede that there is a certain number of like incredibly poor people that will just have absolutely no way to pay their energy bills, who will still be suffering at the point that these prices don't go down?
Yeah, we'll engage in about 30 seconds and flag when I do, because I think that's fair. About the political path dependency, I think the political path dependency exists because governments have promised their people that they would cap their prices on gas. People plan based on this. If governments at some point move away from this policy, this is political suicide. You have led your people to believe you will pay for their gas, and then in the middle of December you said, we will not do this, or you said we will not do this at all, which is to say the governments are path dependent to provide this to their people. Therefore, governments are expected to be liquid, and that's why there's a price hike. This expectation exists even if they're not liquid in the real life. Whereas if you are charging consumers, and this responds to open government, you know that the average middle class person and most of European Union doesn't live in France or Germany is not able to afford a huge price. So yes, prices will be higher due to the reasons we ourselves mentioned, but they will have to be gouged to the capacity of the consumer. So the vast majority of people are not going to be the poor cold people open government describes, but you are going to comparatively get a huge hike towards governments. We break that deadlock. But lastly, the problem with this policy is to some extent irreversible because of the reasons I've described earlier. Yes, Rumen, you will do it indefinitely because if you begin paying for people's gas, if people begin to count that in their plannings of 6 or 7 months ahead, if you veil this in populist rhetoric saying we are the government that will protect you at our own expense, then moving back from this policy is a political hit that the opposition, the anti-EU right wing, which already exists in countries like Italy, can instrumentalize against you, which means that if you need to remove these caps, you will not be able to. So you don't have the smart planning Rumen talks about. I think it's incredibly clear. Closing opposition has already won.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his speech. And now to close the case of the government bench, I'll call on the government whip. I'd like to thank that speaker for her speech. And now to close the case of the opposition bench, and indeed to close the round as a whole, I'll call on the opposition whip.
Okay, am I audible?
You are, yeah.
Wait. I'll put it closer to make it better. Okay, perfect. Okay, I'll receive POIs in the chat from the opening. And if everyone is ready, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The fact that Marta doesn't even bother to rebut the CO's case means that we are necessarily over CG because all of our points are remain standing. And to clarify Dylan's claim that we are trying to knife opening opposition, which is just bad engagement overall, is that if, as Tim said in his first sentence, if you look at the reasons why OG believes that prices are high currently, see that these factors are something that is going to be pushing prices in the long term, which means that we are engaging on the government's characterization, on the government's highest ground, and by that being the only relevant opposition. But I'm going to do more weighing to put us above the other teams. So let's talk a little bit about the inflation. Note here, first of all, that our case is completely independent of the deadlock. That means that inflation happening or not, we are telling you that we have a huge opportunity cost of this money of government that we could have made ourselves energetically independent in the future by continuing the projects of alternative sources. Note here also that as we have established, prices are going to be going up. Russia will be an unpredictable actor, meaning that in the long run, this is the only way that we can make ourselves energetically sustainable by investing in green, by investing in independent sources, and generally investing in this area. By this, we are only putting money in something which is not going to be bringing a great delta. This is how we weigh over opening opposition. Because if you look at the situation, okay, now you have high prices, and as a household, you are spending a lot on electricity and gas. But if, for example, government decides to print money, and by that causes a general inflation, all other prices except from oil are going to be going up. That means that your prices as a household are basically the same. It is just that they are lifted on other things. And if that means that even if opening opposition manages to prove that there is inflation, and we give them that, we are telling you that the delta is relatively small for you as a household, whereas on our side, the delta is huge because you are not having money as a government to invest in alternative sources or to invest in other policies that have the great delta for you as a household. If you lose your job, as they say, the only way where government can sustain their projects of lifting you above the ground is if they have money, which we are proving you that they are not going to be having, because this is going to be such a huge price gap, and unfortunately, as the CG has to has to ride on the model of opening government and do the gap and the delta compared with the pre-2020 levels, this is going to be an enormous amount of money, and government will be dried up for all other projects. What I have proven to you here is that the delta of opening opposition is relatively small, and we take them on that. And we also note here that, and we have also seen here that CG and the OO are in a relative deadlock, because if you look at that, and as I have explained to you, your costs as a household are going to be relatively the same, meaning that the purchasing power is also going to be relatively the same. And that means that outside of the debate land, where you can, I don't know, explain that people look at their receipts from Zara longer than they look at their receipts from the oil company, consumer confidence is going to be same on the both sides, meaning that they do not provide a mechanism stronger than any that CO is bringing to you. But also combine that with all of the trends that are happening in the status quo, and both teams are trying to prove to you that this is going to, I don't know, make them worse, such as inflation and unemployment. They never prove to you why the increase of inflation or the unemployment is going to be so insignificant. If we look at unemployment, as Tin has mentioned, we've had pandemic that has forced thousands of people to lose their job, for example, in the services. We have seen the inflation right now causing firms to have to lay off their staff in order to pay for their electricity bills. They have never proven to us why this is going to be that most significant increase, which is going to be, you know, the reason why we are spending so much of government money and focusing it solely on this. The symmetric argument goes for inflation because of the supply chains and because of pandemic. We have seen inflation for the last 2 years, and we have seen inflation generally happening throughout the decades after the last crisis. They have never proven to us why this is going to be so significant that we are going to have people on the ropes. But before that, I'll take OG.
Yes, there still is that like number of people that like literally going to be unable to pay in the interim. How, like, what do you say to those people when like we can stabilize that and we think those problems are probably going to go away at some point in the future, so it's not like it's that long?
Listen, so Tin has a very direct response, which is also unique to our side. People are not going to freeze to death because they do not have additional, I don't know, 100 euros to pay for their electricity bills, but rather if the governments go into panic state because they cannot just push away this policy because you have bad dependency, and if governments are running out of money, they will go to other resorts in order to try to solve this crisis, and one of which we are witnessing right now, and that is that governments are putting restrictions on you paying the heating. Governments telling you, oh, you cannot put the heating in, I don't know, September and October, and if you have the cold weekend, oh, you are going to be cold. That means that this is more dangerous for these poor people. Governments going into panic state and limiting the amount of heating that you would want to afford to yourself. And if you disregard everything else, only this panic measures are the reason to vote closing opposition. But I believe that the rest of the speech will take it just fine. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for her speech, and indeed all of you for what was a really enjoyable semi-final. I believe we're going to be judging in this room, so if I could ask you all to leave the breakout room